Now, I'm curious, I would like to see a show of hands. How many of you, when you hear the words climate change, you think of this? That's about what I figured, pretty much everybody. Now, how many of you, I wonder, when you hear those same words, think of this? Not quite as many. Growing up as a Cousteau, my grandfather raised me to care about the environment. And as an environmental advocate and a humanitarian, a filmmaker, an explorer, this past year's presidential election has been appalling. Not one single question about the environment in the entire, any of the debates. Right? And for any of us that care about these issues, this is a major wake-up call. Alarm bells should be ringing because we've failed. Conservation has turned into a paralyzing, partisan issue that is preventing us from taking action on some of the most important issues we face today. How's that going to change? How are we going to change the dynamic when it comes to that? Well, I believe that we can. But in order to do so, we have to end the posturing and the rhetoric and recognize that we need to reframe the conversation to change it from one that's about burden to one that's about opportunity. And I have a vision, fear not, that I believe that in the next 10 years, we have the opportunity to end the partisanship around environmental issues in this country. Not going to be easy, as I said. Now, I want to take a second here to examine the stakes. In 0 AD, there were 200 to 300 million people in the world. Let's see, about 2,000 years later or so, when my grandfather was born in 1910, there were 1.6 billion people on this planet. And a little over 100 years later, there were about 7 billion people on this planet today. And then by the middle of this century, there'll be somewhere around 9 billion people on this planet. And as we continue to add more and more people, we continue to impact the environment, and the more that we ignore that impact, the more terrible consequences will continue to affect us. Now, how many people here remember Hurricane Sandy? Pretty much everybody. That was a terrible, terrible storm. But you know what? You know what was most terrible about it, more surprising perhaps, was that it wasn't an anomaly. What was unusual about that storm is how long New York had gone since such a serious, serious storm. If you look at the historical record, typically they happen much, much more often. So Hurricane Sandy caused 9 feet of storm surge. And because of New York's century of wanton destruction of its wetlands and its sand dunes that would have otherwise absorbed much of the damage from that storm, it flooded up to 20% of New York City and caused over $70 billion worth of damage. And if you consider then that mid-range predictions for sea level rise, if they come true, the next storm will make Hurricane Sandy look like a joke. It will be so destructive, more so than we could ever imagine. But it's not just here that the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation are taking hold. It's happening all over the world. Take Syria, for example. Now, some of you may be asking me, what does Syria have to do with climate change or environmental degradation? Well, what many of you may not know is that, in fact, the roots of that conflict were caused by drought. Unprecedented drought over the last decade or so in Syria that drove people out of the countryside, the collapse of agricultural industry. They fled to the cities. And because of the pressure in those cities, the inability to meet the needs of those people, food and water and shelter, the people protested, and the government cracked down. And that resulted in the full-scale civil war that we see today. Now consider this, that we are well on our way to a 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures within the next few decades. And that with every 2 degrees of rise in temperature, we can expect about 1 meter rise in sea level, at least. 3 feet. And that with every 3 feet rise in sea level, 100 million people will be displaced. Now let's think about that in the context of Syria, folks. The civil war there displaced 1 million people that migrated to Europe seeking a better life. And that has completely destabilized the entire global geopolitical status quo. Now imagine when it's 100 million people that are fleeing their homes over the next half a century. What is that going to do? And it's not just in developing countries. It's here in the United States, the Southeast United States, predictions for what 1 meter of sea level rise will do. Entire metropolitan areas underwater. These are looming threats that we cannot afford to ignore. One of the things that you may not know about me, actually, is that I have a degree in history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And I can tell you with certainty that the partisanship around conservation and environmental issues was not always the case. It was not always the political football that it is today. In fact, I dream of the good old days of Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon, a very conservative president, he was actually an incredible environmental advocate, continuing decades of conservative and Republican support for environmental issues. Think about this. Nixon, he passed the Clean Air Act extension, the Safe Water Drinking Act, the Endangered Species Act. He created NOAA and, hold your horses, the EPA. Now, why would he do something like that, right? I mean, the states were so good at self-regulating themselves, right? You know, one of the states, this is my favorite, Ohio, you've probably heard of it. Ohio was so proud of its achievements, it threw a big party. That's right. And even, as part of that party, a big bonfire. No, wait, I'm sorry, that's a different slide. That's not a bonfire. That's a river. Liquid water. Burning. Because of years of dumping and pollution, poor regulation and corruption. And this happened almost a dozen times over the first half of the 20th century. Finally, in the 60s, it woke the American public up. And Congress and Nixon came together to recognize that protecting the environment is in the best interest of the American people. It's the most important thing that we can do. So how do we get back to that golden Nixonian era? Well, first, we would be all a lot better off if we could agree that human dignity and purpose and opportunity are the starting places to address environmental issues. In fact, that protecting the environment is about fundamental human dignity. It's about healthy communities, about wholesome food for our children. It's about true energy independence and good, sustainable jobs. Now, if we're going to get there, we've got a long way to go. We've got an administration down the street whose current approach to dealing with these issues is just to wipe a term off a website or appoint science deniers to positions of power, or maybe put some gag orders on the Park Service, big bad Park Service. In doing so, they are condemning millions of people to needless suffering. They're making our country more poor, less free, and less safe. But it's not all bad news. 2 days ago, I had the opportunity to host an event about ocean health on Capitol Hill with Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a Republican from the Southern District of Florida, down southern Miami and the Florida Keys, a place where this happened about 3 months ago. You see, Miami is dealing with the consequences of climate change and sea level rise on an almost daily basis. The streets are flooding. And at one particular high tide, this photograph was taken of an octopus crawling in a parking garage in downtown Miami. Representative Curbelo recognizes that we have to take action. He is the co-founder of the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House that is growing almost daily. He's part of a new generation that believes if we can reframe these issues around conservation and the environment in more Republican standard issues of economic development and opportunity, that we can make real progress together in a bipartisan fashion. So that's some good news. Here's some more good news. I work with young people every day through my nonprofit EarthEcho International, around the country and around the world. And I promise you, none of them question the value of protecting the environment. None of them question the importance of clean air and clean water. of fighting for our oceans, of combating climate change. You know what they do question? They question why our leaders would mortgage their futures so selfishly. And they are fired up. But as a movement of people who care about these issues, we need to do a better job today of priming the pump, of paving the way for them. We have to accept some of the blame for the current state of affairs. Maybe instead of relying on pictures of dying coral reefs and melting ice caps, which are all important issues, we should focus more on conservation as an opportunity to solve problems, to provide people, human beings, with the fundamental dignity and purpose that comes with putting a roof over your head, with feeding your children, just like it does for the people in the renewable energy industry, who now outnumber people in oil, coal, and natural gas combined. Now, reframing the issue is going to take some hard thinking, but one of the things that we need to do is maybe recognize that too often we rely on serious scientific reports and very stern documentaries, that too often rely on alarmism and doom and gloom. As Governor Martin O'Malley reminded me a few months ago, by catastrophizing the issues facing the environment, we make the deniers look optimistic. And I would argue that while these issues are indeed serious, sometimes, well, maybe sometimes, they're too serious to take too seriously. That we've lost the sense of imagination and wonder and opportunity and excitement that comes with protecting our planet, the world around us, the world that sustains us, and that we've lost the humor too. Now, recently, I had the opportunity to work on a show with GreatBigStory.com, where what we did is we created a new series called The Aquatic World of Philippe Cousteau that is looking at an entirely new way of telling these stories with a lot of humor and a few cocktails.
Far below the ocean's surface, an elite team of oceanographers explores the briny deep. The skilled submariners are led by this man.
Welcome.
World-renowned environmentalist and educator Philippe Cousteau.
Great Big Story presents a marine motion picture like no other.
Oceanauts, engage.
Learn the mysteries of the deep from the elite crew of mariners.
Magnificent.
Shot in magnificent aquascope. See the submarine world like never before. In a vision so fantastic, the life you know may never be the same.
We are people, right?
Nice and easy now.
I think one of the infants has taken a liking to the ship.
So he has.
The Aquatic World with Philippe Cousteau.
So what I want you to take away from that is the idea that we need new approaches. We need to think outside the box. Again, to look at conservation as an opportunity to solve problems of hope and dignity for human beings. And that if we do that, if we do our jobs right here, right now, today, we can chart a new course. We can truly come together as a nation to recognize the opportunity and the potential that we all have to make this world a better place. I like to think about a message and a vision that my grandfather and father shared with me growing up. That every single child born on this planet has the right to breathe fresh air and to drink clean water, to walk on green grass under a blue sky. So, with that in mind, and as the closing speaker, cheers.